How do we have these awkward conversations? How do we stand up against, we've spoken tonight about the comparison of what is a woman, how ridiculous it is that we even have that conversation, about having to defend the fact that men should not be competing in women's sports. Why is it like all this ridiculousness of the changing of language, of the LGBT acronym that's constantly changing, evolving, and words that constantly are being changed and have different meanings now? And how do we actually stand up against all this craziness? How do we speak out against the wrong? How do we stand up for what's true? And well, let's look at what Jesus did in the face of this. And I'm going to look at Luke 19 from verse 45. And the heading is Jesus at the temple. And yes, you know this story. Then he entered the temple area and began driving out those who were selling. It is written, he said to them, my house will not be a house, my house will be a house of prayer, but you have made it into a den of robbers. Every day he was teaching at the temple, but the chief priests, the teachers of the law, and the leaders among the people were trying to kill him. Yet they could not find any way to do it because all the people hung on his words. I think there's a couple of really important things here is, as we were talking about standing up against things, we spoke about Riley Gaines being threatened. We talk about Matt Walsh, having to have 24-hour security and protection against all these things that, even Jesus, like they were trying to kill him. They were trying to kill him because they were ruining their money ticket. He was ruining their money ticket. That's pretty much all it was. Like they liked their power, their authority. They were making money from it. They had status in society. And it's very similar to what we're going through now. Like it's no different to all this wokeness and all this craziness. It's just about status. It's about showing that you're woke and the accolades you get from that. And talking about the athletics and the people at Penn State with Will Thomas that first of all were against it and were crying because they lost out, and then all of a sudden they're all happy and excited and saying it's the best thing in the world because they're looking for their status. They're looking for, who knows if they got paid off, who knows if they got offered positions, who knows what it is. But just like the Pharisees that and the chief priests that Jesus was talking about against, they were selling things in the making money off selling offerings to the people in the temple, and it was just pretty much a marketplace and all the other things they got at. And a couple of things that Jesus does is, like, well, we know he went and turned over the tables. In the other version, he turned over tables and he really got nasty at it all, right? Stand up for what you know is right and go aggressively. That's fine as long as you've got the Lord behind you. Do it righteously, but stand up for things. The fact that he says it is written. Dr. Rod mentioned before about the fact that we need to be researched. We need to know what the facts are. So spend the time chasing those facts. But the finishing line of this was something that I actually, before I hand over to Dr. Rod, the finishing line, verse 48, yet they could not find any way to do it because all the people hung on his word. You know what? They hung on his word because there was truth in his word. There was love in his word. There was power in his word. And I know you may feel like it's the majority that we're fighting against. I know you feel like it's the majority that are trying to push this woke agenda. It's actually not. It's a loud minority. That's all it is. But when you start speaking truth, when you start speaking these things, people will hang on your every word. And when you actually stand up as a leader and speak out against the things that God has called you to speak out against, when you speak in truth, that's when you'll start to attract people around you. That's when you can do your true leadership, because you're attracting the right people around you, the people that are aligned with your values, what you're called to. Because if you're just standing there pretending to do this woke agenda, you're attracting people that don't believe in what you believe in. So how are you meant to lead them? But when you stand up for your truth, not only do people hang on to every word, but the naysayers will become more and more fearful of coming against you, like the teachers were afraid to go against Jesus because he had a crowd around him. He had people that admired him, that appreciated, that valued what he had to say. Dr. Rod, what do you take from that verse as a lesson for leaders?
Well, really all I can say is ditto what you've shared with us. Jesus knew who he was, and he knew what his purpose was. And that is really what drove him during the entirety of his ministry. People were trying to kill him from the very beginning of his public ministry. I don't think they tried to kill him over changing the water into wine. No. But it wasn't too long when he stood up in the synagogue and read from the scriptures. That was when he started to upset people. Yeah. And they were upset primarily because he threatened the establishment. He threatened to undermine the establishment. The establishment was built on power and wealth, which was obtained unjustly. And he stood against that. You see, there was nothing wrong, ethically wrong, with what was happening there in the temple, because under the law, if the money changers, their job was a legitimate job. Yep. To change the money into the right currency. It had to be the temple currency. Yep. That was fine. The selling of doves, for example, that was fine as well, because under the law, if you had to travel a long way to get to Jerusalem 3 times every year as a male, you didn't have to bring the animals for sacrifice. You could actually buy them there. Mm-hmm. What made it a den of thieves, of course, was the fact that all of the traders were ripping off the people. Yeah. And that was something that grossly offended Jesus, because the average person, Israelite, was quite poor. They most of them barely scratched out a subsistence living. Many, we believe from historical evidence, were living very close to and some below starvation level. And yet there were extortionate exchange rates that were placed on exchanging whatever currency you were carrying into the temple currency in order to pay the temple tax. And those who were selling the doves and the other animals for sacrifice were exploiting their monopoly position. They were exploiting the vulnerability of those who had travelled a long way. Yep. That was what offended Jesus. It wasn't the fact that trading was going on. Yep. The Bible actually takes a very high view of commerce. Mm-hmm. Not everybody would agree with that, but I think a reasonable reading of the Bible would suggest that the Bible takes a very high view of commerce. So the issue wasn't commerce. The issue was that people were being ripped off. That's why Jesus got angry. That's why he overturned the tables, and that's why he quoted from the Old Testament when he said, "My house shall be called a house of prayer." He was quoting from Isaiah 56 verse 7 there. And then he quoted again from the Old Testament, "But you have turned it into a den of thieves." So it wasn't the fact that these commercial transactions were going on that offended Jesus. It was the fact that the establishment was exploiting the ordinary people. And guess what? We see that today. Yes. And we've touched on this throughout our conversation today and in recent conversations as well, where the establishment has political and economic power and is actually exploiting those who are in a weaker position for their own benefit.
I want to jump on something that you alluded to in that, and you actually mentioned a few times before, and I think that it does kind of sum up what we're speaking about. And you said identity. Like that's the challenge here. People are struggling with identity. What is their identity? And they're trying to find meaning. And I like looking at like what is a woman is challenging people's identity. Like they don't know what their identity is. This men trying to go into women's sports and looking at the LGBTZYQ, everyone's just like, no one knows what their identity is. And you also mentioned, what was her name? Blair White, talking about that she had the gender dysphoria. That's just a challenge of identity. Like that's just not knowing who you are. And I think that the answer on both sides of this, because we're talking today about being a leader and having these awkward conversations. We just have to have these awkward conversations with people. We have to do as a leader. We can't shy away from these things. So we need to know what our identity is. We need to know what our purpose is, what our calling is as a leader, to know what we are called to do, to be able to stand in the fullness of what God's called us to. We need to have that identity. But also looking at the other side of the people that are challenged by all these situations, they're lacking identity. They're struggling with their own identity, and so they're trying to find their identity in these other things. But there's only one thing that our identity is in. One. And that's Christ. Our identity is in Christ. And when we understand who we are in Christ, that is where we have assurance in one, standing up against all these things as a leader and speaking against these awkward conversations we need to have, but also speaking against the challenges of actually going through these situations ourselves of having identity. But also it's our responsibility as leaders to make sure that the people that we are leading, the people that we are influencing, the people that are following us, that we are helping them understand what their identity is. Part of our mission here is to, as we said, we're on a mission to eradicate poor leadership. But we believe we do that through, first of all, understanding what our purpose is, our identity, what our purpose is in Christ, what God has called us to, the purpose He's called us to. And then our role is to help others discover what their purpose, what their identity is in this world. And that only when we live in our truth, live in our purpose, live in our identity, and help others live out their truth, live on their purpose with identity in Christ, can we see true fulfillment. And that is what real leadership is. If you want to figure out, if you want to learn out any more about how to do that, our free leadership development program down in the description, or here, check out the QR code there. Yes, we've got a free leadership development program where we first spend the first 10 weeks on teaching you how to understand what your purpose, what your calling is in life. And it's only once we understand that, once we understand what our calling is, what our purpose is, that we have the strength to be able to stand up as leaders and have these awkward conversations. To stand up and fight as Jesus did, fight against the wrongdoing and attract the right people. It's only through Christ that we can do that. Hey, you just watched an excerpt from the On the Cube Leadership Podcast. If you like that, hit the like button and put a comment below. Hey, if you want to watch more videos like this, check out our channel, and while you're there, make sure you subscribe.